There are things that happen in hospitals during the early morning hours that science can't explain. I learned this in my first week on the night shift in the geriatric ward, specifically in the section dedicated to Alzheimer's patients. The smell of antiseptic, the constant beeping of heart monitors, the occasional groan from a patient. I expected all of that. What I didn't expect was to discover that sometimes, when a patient says they see something impossible, the impossible might really be there, watching, waiting, smiling. Linda was my first special patient. 87 years old, mid-stage Alzheimer's, admitted for 3 months. During the day, she was like any other patient, confused, sometimes agitated, often lost in her own fragmented memories. But something changed when night fell. A disturbing clarity would take over her, especially when she talked about the man in black. "He stands right there," she told me on my first night, pointing to the empty corner of the room. Just watching, smiling, always smiling. The head nurse had warned me about Linda's hallucinations. It was common in patients with her condition. Ignoring them was protocol, but there was something different about the way Linda described her nighttime visitor. It wasn't the typical confusion of Alzheimer's patients. Her eyes held an intense focus. Her hands trembled, not from weakness, but from genuine fear. "He wears an old black suit," she continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "One of those with a vest and a pocket watch chain. But it's his eyes. His eyes are like black holes. And when he smiles, God help me, when he smiles, it's like all the warmth in the world disappears." The other nurses on the shift laughed at Linda's stories. "She's always making up something new," they'd say during the shift change. "Last week it was a clown, now it's a man in black." But I had noticed it was different. The fear in her voice when she talked about him was consistent, real. And there were the details, always the same, always precise, even when she could barely remember her own name. The first time I felt something was during my rounds at 3 a.m. The corridor of the geriatric ward was lit only by the faint glow of emergency lights, casting elongated shadows on the walls. The silence was broken only by the soft sounds of respirators and heart monitors. I was checking prescriptions when I felt it, a cold hand on my right shoulder. It wasn't the usual chill of a hospital. It was a cold that seemed to penetrate to your bones, to your soul. I turned sharply, but the corridor was empty. My heart raced, but I tried to stay calm. I was alone in that ward. The other nurses were downstairs taking a coffee break. I was probably just tired, imagining things. That's when I heard Linda's voice coming from her room. "He's here. He touched you, didn't he?" I ran to her room, my hands trembling as I held the clipboard. Linda was sitting up in bed, perfectly straight, her eyes fixed on the door. There was a frightening clarity in her gaze. "He likes you," she whispered. "He likes your fear. That's how it starts. First the touch, then the smile, and then he starts showing up in your dreams." How did you know something touched me?" I asked, my voice breaking. Linda's smile was sad, knowing, because that's how it started with me too. It began 3 months ago, right after I was admitted. The cold touch, the sound of footsteps, the pocket watch chain jingling in the silence. And that smile, that terrible smile that looks like Gad's tearing his face in half. In the following nights, I started to notice small things. The sound of footsteps when no one was in the hall, doors of empty rooms closing by themselves, the distant jingling of an old pocket watch chain, and that constant feeling of being watched, especially near Linda's room. The unnatural cold that appeared out of nowhere, even on the warmest days. The other patients began to act strangely too. Mrs. Martinez from room 204 refused to sleep with her back to the door. Mr. Wilson from room 208 would scream every time. He looked at certain corners of his room, and everyone, without exception, seemed more restless during the early morning hours. It was on my 6th night that I finally saw him. I was doing the routine check of vital signs when I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. There, outside the glass door of the nurse's station, stood a tall man wearing an old black suit. His face had a smile that made my blood run cold. It wasn't a human smile. It was too wide, too fixed, like a grotesque mask of joy. And his eyes, Linda was right. They were like black holes, sucking in all the light, all the hope. I blinked and he was gone. My legs were shaking so much I had to sit down. That's when Linda's room intercom buzzed. "He showed you the smile, didn't he?" Her voice was almost a whisper. "Now you know. Now you understand why I'm so scared. He won't stop. He never stops." What does he want?" I managed to ask. The silence on the other end lasted an eternity. "Company," she finally replied. "He picks people, watches them, learns their fears, and then he starts appearing in your dreams. And when that happens, well, you've probably noticed how much worse my condition has gotten in the past few days. That same night, Linda had a cardiac arrest. When we arrived in her room, she was already in a systole. But her face had an expression of pure terror, and her eyes were fixed on the corner of the room, the same corner where she always said he stood. The marks on her arms showed she had struggled against something or someone before she died. The following week, I quit my job. The other nurses said it was normal. The night shift wasn't for everyone. But it wasn't because of the shift. It was because of the dreams that started after Linda died. Dreams where a man in a black suit smiles at me. Dreams where his smile gets bigger and bigger, less and less human. Dreams where I hear the jingling of his pocket watch chain getting closer. Now I work only during the day, at a small clinic. But I still hear news from the hospital. It seems the new night shift nurse is having trouble sleeping. She says she feels a presence at the nurse's station, that sometimes when she's alone doing her notes, she feels a cold hand on her shoulder, and the worst part? Last week she mentioned seeing a strange man reflected in the glass, a man wearing an old black suit with a smile far too big to be real, exactly like Linda described, exactly like I saw that night. And when she told me this, I noticed something in her eyes, the same terrifying clarity I had seen in Linda's eyes. The doctors insist it was a coincidence, that Linda's heart simply stopped, as happens with many elderly patients, that the marks on her arms were self-inflicted during an episode of agitation, that everything has a rational explanation. But then I remember the cold touch on my shoulder, the inhuman smile through the glass, and the terror in Linda's eyes in her final moments. And I know that somewhere, in those silent hospital corridors, during the long hours of the night, he's still there, waiting, smiling, choosing his next companion. They say you never forget your first date. In my case, that's literally true, but not for the romantic reasons you might imagine. It's been 2 years since that night at St. Clair Psychiatric Hospital, and I still wake up in a cold sweat. When I dream about that smile, that terrible smile that invited us to go down, that promised something far worse than death. It all started as an attempt to be different. Emily and I had met on Tinder, and after a week of chatting, we wanted something more exciting than the typical coffee or movie. She mentioned being fascinated by abandoned places. Wanting to impress her, I suggested St. Clair, a psychiatric hospital shut down 15 years ago after several suspicious incidents with patients. "It'll be fun," I said. "Something to tell our grandkids," I joked, trying to sound confident. Emily loved the idea. We agreed to meet in the abandoned parking lot at 7 p.m. There'd still be some daylight, but dark enough to create that adventurous vibe we were looking for. Emily arrived first. She was wearing a black leather jacket and carrying a backpack with flashlights, water, and a first aid kit. "Always prepared," she smiled. Her smile was genuine, warm, the opposite of the one we'd encounter later. St. Clair was an imposing 5-story building with architecture that mixed Victorian elements with modern brutalism. Decades of abandonment had turned what was once white into sickly shades of grey and brown. Broken windows, old graffiti, ivy creeping up the walls. It was the perfect image of urban decay. We found a side entrance that was already busted open. The smell of mold and decomposition hit us immediately. Our flashlights revealed long hallways covered in debris, old papers scattered across the floor, rusted gurneys abandoned like metal skeletons. The walls still held pieces of the original. Decorative wallpaper, geometric figures that seemed to shift in the shadows. "They say the last director went insane," Emily commented as we explored the first floor. "Started doing experiments on the patients. Something about fear as a treatment for mental illness. Her voice echoed down the empty hallways, creating a disturbing reverberation. It was on the 3rd floor that things started to change. The sound of a door slamming broke the silence. It could have been the wind, of course, but there wasn't a breeze that night. Then came the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere above us. "Probably another explorer," I whispered, not believing my own words. Emily squeezed my hand, her fingers cold. We moved toward the stairs, planning to head down and get out of there. That's when we heard the voice. "You young folks always go up." The voice was hoarse, like it hadn't been used in years. "Oh, why don't you come down? It's much more interesting down below." A figure emerged from the shadows at the top of the stairs. A middle-aged man wearing what looked like an old medical coat, stained with something dark. His face had a smile that made my stomach churn. It was too wide, too fixed, like it had been carved into his flesh. "The basement is still active," he continued, stepping down one stair. "We still have some patients there. Special patients. They'd love to meet you." His smile grew even wider, revealing yellowed, jagged teeth. "Fear is still the best medicine, you know, and you two, you have so much potential for fear." Emily reacted first, pulling me toward the hallway. We ran like we'd never run before. The sound of footsteps followed us, along with that laughter, a laugh that seemed to come from all directions at once. Doors slammed open and shut around us. Shadows moved in the darkness, and that voice kept calling us. "Why run? The treatment's just begun. Come meet my other patients. They're so lonely down there, so hungry for company." We found a broken window on the 2nd floor. Emily didn't hesitate. She jumped onto the ledge below. I followed her, fear giving me an agility I never knew I had. Behind us, that laughter echoed through the empty hospital walls. "You'll be back," the voice promised. "Everyone comes back. Fear always brings them back." We ran across the parking lot without looking back, jumped into our cars, and sped off with tires screeching. I didn't stop driving until I was 20 miles away, at a brightly lit gas station. Emily called me minutes later. She had driven non-stop until she felt safe too. We met at a 24-hour diner, trying to process what had happened. The stains on his coat, now that we could think clearly, we realized they looked like dried blood. And those teeth, no human should have teeth like that. I did some research about the hospital when I got home. Emily told me a few days later. The last director, Dr. Harris, disappeared when the hospital was shut down, but before that, there were experiments. He believed he could cure mental illness by exposing patients to extreme terror. Said fear purified the mind. The official records talk about dozens of deaths, but the staff said it was hundreds, that there was a secret wing in the basement, that the screams never stopped. We never saw each other again after that night, not because of a lack of interest. The shared experience had created a deep connection between us, but every time we tried to make plans, that voice echoed in our minds. "You'll be back." It was like he was waiting, watching, anticipating our next attempt to meet. 2 years passed. I moved to a new city, tried to move on. But sometimes, on the darkest nights, I wake up with that smile burned into my mind. And when the wind blows a certain way, I could swear I hear that laughter. Emily moved too, to another state. We talk occasionally, always avoiding any mention of that night. But last week she sent me a message that chilled my blood. "Are you dreaming about him too? About the stairs going down to the basement? About the special patients? St. Clair was demolished last year. They say they found extensive tunnels beneath the building, much deeper and more complex than the original blueprints indicated. And in one of those tunnels, carved into the wall, there was a message. Fear is eternal, and you'll be back." Now, I avoid dating apps. I avoid abandoned hospitals. I avoid any place that reminds me of that night. But in my research about St. Clair, I discovered something disturbing. We weren't the first ones to encounter that man. Other couples, other explorers, they all report the same thing. The man in the lab coat, the impossible smile, the invitation to go down. Some of those explorers disappeared. Others went insane. And some, like Emily and me, live with the constant, Terror that one day, when we least expect it, we'll hear that voice again. Because deep down we know he was right. Fear is eternal. And part of us, a part we don't want to admit, wants to go back, wants to go down, wants to meet the special. Patients still waiting in the dark. Fever distorts reality in ways you never thought possible. It started at 100.4 degrees where a persistent headache, sensitivity to light, that uncomfortable stiffness in my neck. Michael insisted I go to the doctor, but I was too stubborn. It's just the flu, I said. If only I had known that this flu would open doors that should never be opened. On the second day, the fever climbed to 103.1. Wow. That's when the voices began. They weren't adult voices. They were children's laughter, childish whispers coming from the dark corners of the house. Michael was at work, and I tried to convince myself it was just fever delirium. But the voices felt so real. They called my name, asked me to play, said they had a secret to share. The stiffness in my neck worsened. Every movement was torture. The sunlight through the curtains felt like knives in my eyes. That's when I saw the first child, a little girl in a white dress standing in the hallway. She smiled and said, "He's coming to visit you, Daniel." Is coming, Daniel, my ex-husband, the man who turned 3 years of my life into a nightmare of psychological and physical abuse, the man I hadn't seen in 5 years since I finally found the courage to run away, the man who swore he would find me again, no matter where I was. Michael found me unconscious in the bathroom hours later. The fever had spiked to 104 degrees. At the hospital, the diagnosis came quickly: bacterial meningitis. I needed isolation, strong, antibiotics, constant monitoring. The hallucinations, they assured me, were normal with such a high fever, but the children didn't leave. In the hospital room, their whispers mixed with the beeping of the monitors. They played hide and seek among the medical equipment, their laughter echoing off the sterile walls. The girl in the white dress appeared more often, always with the same warning. "He's coming, Daniel is almost here." Michael stayed with me until visiting hours were over. "I'll be back early tomorrow," he promised, kissing my forehead. I tried to ask him to stay, but my throat was too dry, my mind too foggy from the medication. The nurses assured me I'd be safe. That isolation meant no one but the medical staff could enter. It was at 3:17 a.m. when the door to my room opened. At first, I thought it was another hallucination, the familiar silhouette standing against the hallway light. But then I smelled it. Menthol cigarettes and cheap aftershave. The smell of Daniel. "It's been a while, darling." His voice was exactly as I remembered, that falsely sweet tone that always preceded his worst moments. "You look awful. I almost didn't believe it when I heard you were in the hospital. Good thing I've got contacts here." I tried to press the emergency button, but my movements were slow, uncoordinated from the fever and medication. Daniel approached the bed, his smile growing in the shadows. No, none of that. We need to talk about your new husband." The way he said husband made my stomach turn. It was the same tone he used before his violent episodes. "Michael is an interesting man," he continued, grabbing my medical chart and flipping through it casually. "An engineer, right? Lives on Cypress Street, 247, leaves for work at 7:15 every morning. Always so punctual." My heart raced on the monitor. How did he know so many details? Had he been following us? The fever made the room spin, shadows dancing on the walls. The children had stopped laughing. Now they were all standing in the corners of the room, watching. "It would be a shame," Daniel whispered, leaning close to my ear, "if something happened to him." Accidents are so common these days, especially with people who steal what's mine. I tried to scream, but my throat felt closed. Daniel laughed, that cruel laugh that haunted my nightmares. "Rest up, darling. You're going to need your strength for what's coming." And just like that, he disappeared through the door, leaving only the smell of cigarettes and the echo of his threat behind. In the morning, I convinced myself it had been just another hallucination. The fever, the medication, my old fear of Daniel. My mind had created that nightmare. Until the morning shift nurse made a casual comment. Your friend Daniel seemed really worried last night. We don't usually allow visitors after hours, but he was so insistent. The panic I felt at that moment was unlike anything the fever had caused. I begged Michael to check the hospital security cameras to call the police, but my fever was still high, and the doctors assured him that hallucinations were common with meningitis. Desperate, I sent a message to Daniel's old number. "Why did you threaten me last night?" His reply came hours later. "What are you talking about? I've been in Texas for 3 months. Stop making trouble." I showed the message to Michael, the doctors, the nurses. Proof that I was delirious, they said. How could Daniel be in Texas and at the hospital at the same time? The nurse who mentioned his visit must have confused me with another patient. Everything had a rational explanation, they repeated. But then why did the smell of menthol cigarettes linger in the room? Why did I find fingerprints on my medical chart, exactly where he had touched? And the children? Why were they now whispering warnings about Daniel waiting for Michael to leave for work? The fever finally broke after 5 days. The doctors celebrated my recovery as a success. The hallucinations of the children stopped. But something changed, permanently that night. Every time Michael leaves for work, I wonder if Daniel was really there. If those threats were real. Sometimes late at night I still smell menthol cigarettes in the air. And occasionally, very rarely, I hear the voice of the girl in the white dress. He's still waiting. He always waits. I wonder if the meningitis really caused those hallucinations, or if the fever just opened my senses to something that was always there. If Daniel really visited me that night, or if my fear of him is so deep it can create alternate realities. Michael installed cameras at home. We changed our routine, replaced the locks, but every time someone mentions the name Daniel, every time I smell menthol cigarettes, my heart races. Because deep down, it doesn't matter if it was real or a hallucination. The terror of that night changed something fundamental in me. The meningitis may have been cured, but the fear remains. And on the darkest nights, when the fever of memory returns, I wonder if the children were trying to warn me about something that's still coming. If Daniel, real or imagined, is still out there, waiting for the right moment to turn his threats into reality. If these stories gave you chills and made you think twice before exploring abandoned places or visiting hospitals, then you know what to do. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming disturbing stories. And if you've ever experienced something unexplainable or know someone who's been through a terrifying encounter, share it in the comments. Who knows? Your story might be featured in our next video. Oh, and don't forget to comment which story gave you the biggest chills. We'd love to know. See you in the next video, if you're brave enough to come back.